Okay, what used to be the norm was that if you had more than 50% of the shares of a subsidiary company, you then had control, and therefore you were a parent company, and therefore you had to draw up group financial statements. So as soon as you have control of another company, and that can be simply the fact that you own 50% or more of the shares. Sorry, you have to have 50% plus of the shares of the subsidiary company. And according to the accounting standards, you then have to draw up consolidated financial statements. In other words, you have to draw up group financial statements. Okay. But now that, yeah? That's right. In these examples that we've done just right earlier, we assume that we have 100% of the shares of the subsidiary. Okay. We will later do situations where we have less than 100% of the shares of the subsidiary. Okay. So there isn't much change, and I'll show you why. But basically, yeah, we've been dealing with this as though we own 100%. Okay, so you still have to draw up consolidated group financial statements if you own, say, 60% of the shares of the subsidiary. So if you have control, so if you have more than 50% of the voting rights, which means that you generally, obviously if you have more than 50% of the shares, you generally have more than 50% of the voting rights. And therefore, you have control because you basically you have a say regarding any decisions that are made. Okay? They've basically said, okay, it's not that straightforward. What we do now is we actually, sometimes you can own less than 50% of the shares but still have control. Okay, let's just go into that in a bit more detail. Basically, do you have power, exposure to variable returns? So the three criteria to determine if you have control. I'm just writing this up for them too. And you have the ability to affect amount of variable returns. You have the ability to affect the amount of variable returns. So basically, what do we mean by power? Generally arises from rights, so voting rights give you power. So generally, if you've got more than 50% of the shares, you have power. You have exposure to variable returns. What does that mean? Obviously, if you're a shareholder, the profits go up some years, they go down some years. You will obviously, your share price will go up, will go down, and also obviously your dividends are going to vary as well, depending on the profits that are made. So you're not getting a fixed interest rate, for example. So like, if you've got a loan, or if you've got an investment where you're earning interest at a fixed rate, that's different from owning shares in a subsidiary. In a subsidiary, you're obviously going to then have exposure to what we call variable returns. So depending on whether the company makes profits or makes losses, etc. You'll understand what's meant by that. Okay, and also that for control to exist, you must have power, exposure to variable returns. The reason why they actually say this is because sometimes what actually happens is a company might not be doing well, and someone takes control of the company for a management fee. They get a management fee and they take control. In that situation, the company is not the subsidiary because this person or the company that's taken control gets a fixed fee. Okay, so they don't have exposure to variable returns. Okay, the last one is that you actually have the ability to affect the variable returns. So how would you as shareholders, say you had 70% of the shares of a company, how would you be able to affect the returns? How would you be able to influence the returns? How would you be able to influence your profits or your dividends or your share price? You obviously have voting rights, and obviously you've got to vote on a whole lot of decisions which are made by the company, and therefore you can have some impact or influence on those variable returns. Okay, you as shareholder actually are regarded as being an owner of the company. So if you actually own more than 60% of the shares or 70% of the shares, then obviously you can influence the profits because you actually have voting rights and you can vote on a whole lot of decisions which are made by the company. Does that make sense? Okay, so basically to have control you need to have power, which generally comes from your voting rights. Exposure to variable returns is the big word, variable. It's not a fixed return, and you can actually influence or you can affect those variable returns. Okay. It's actually not necessary, so this is an interesting one, that the investor actually exercises your power. So you can actually be, have 60% of the shares of a company in, I don't know, where do you want to have shares in a company? What country? So shall I just say the UK? You've got 60% of the shares in a company in the UK, but you actually really think that the board of directors is very good, you think it's being very well managed, so you don't actually really do anything. You don't attend the meetings, you don't vote on anything, you basically don't exercise your power. Does that mean you haven't got control? Sorry? Does that mean you haven't got control? What do you think? Exactly. So if something goes wrong, at any point you can step in and say, actually, I'm not happy about this, I'm taking over now. Okay? So basically you have that potential to take over at any point if you're not happy. Okay, so it's not that you necessarily are exercising power, it's that you have the potential capacity. You have the capacity to exercise power. Because you have 60% of the shares, you can, at any point, if you're not happy, you can take over and just say, okay, I'm running the show now. Okay, I was happy with how it was run, but you guys are taking advantage, so therefore I'm running the show. Okay, its capacity to control or exercise power is what's important. Okay, any questions there? Variable returns, I've spoken quite a bit about this. And you also have power to influence the variable returns. They just say power implies influence over and exposure to variable returns. Only one party can control another company. So if there is a 50% ownership by one company and a 50% by another company, neither of them control. Okay, so neither of them are the parent company, and therefore neither of them have to draw up consolidated group financial statements. Okay, nearly done. Any questions there? Okay, and that's what they say about joint control. Situations in which control might exist. So what we say is majority voting rights, so majority shares are owned. I think this is the last slide, you've done very well, I must say. Majority voting rights generally comes with the majority share ownership. Okay, where there is less than a majority of voting rights, in other words, you might have 45% of the shares, but perhaps where the balance of voting rights are widely dispersed. So, for example, you have a situation where you've got 45%, and everyone else is like 2%, 2%. So there's a whole lot of people who have 2%, like literally, I don't know, 30 people approximately have 2% of the shares, okay? In that situation, you could actually, and say as well that these people don't actually live in the country, they don't take any interest. Generally what you find is if you have only 2% of the shares, you generally don't take an active role. If you have 45% of the shares, you're much more likely to be caring about what's happening because you're obviously much more exposed into it. You've got far more invested. So therefore in that situation, you could only have 45% of the shares, but you might be the only one actually attending the meetings. You might be the only one who's actually in that country, for example. obviously these days we've got a lot of technology which can mean that even if you're not in the country, you can actually actively participate via, these teleconferencing types of setups. But we do say if you've got that kind of situation, particularly if people are very geographically dispersed, they're not kind of actively participating, they have very small percentages ownership, then obviously in that situation, would you actually say that you probably have control there? Okay, the only thing that possibly could happen there is that obviously those people, I could say, okay, I've got 2%, you think that you own the show, so I'm just going to form a little Facebook group and ask anyone who's got shares in the company to join the Facebook group, and we're going to basically run the show. We're going to join together and become powerful. So obviously if that situation exists, then this guy's been knocked out. Okay. But obviously you have to, if you had a question like that, they'd have to indicate that these people have actually joined together, and and that's the great thing about the internet, is that you can form these networks, and you can, as a small person or small, with no power, you can actually become quite powerful. Okay. Well, good. Obviously, hopefully for good. Sorry. Okay. So in this particular case, if it's quite clear that this person is the only one who's actually basically has control, then that company would have to drop group financial statements, even though they haven't got more than 50%. Okay, so the accounting standards would actually simply state that company does in fact have control, looking at the situation. This company does have control.
How would they know?
How would they know? I guess, yeah, good question. Very good question. Well, they could simply look at the actual, AGM and the records of the AGM, and they'd be able to see. Yeah, if they had any suspicion, they could certainly get some kind of evidence over a number of years. Yeah, but that's a very good question. Okay, so I think we're going to end there. Any other questions?